first panel this morning is moderated by Ms. Sarah Schlessinger, Chief Executive Officer at the Texas Water Foundation, and certainly no stranger to Groundwater or this group, as Sarah was previously the Executive Director of TAG. Welcome, Sarah, and the panelists.
Thanks. Good morning. It is so good to see so many friends. It's been a long time. I want to share with you my favorite Dr. Robert Mace quote, which I think is appropriate to yesterday's meeting and today's panel. He said, once upon a time, "We will all be in a cone of depression when C.E. Williams retires." Whether you live in Austin's growing tech metropolis or in the far reaches of Dumas, Texas, you've probably noticed a change in our workforce. Entire sectors have become automated, many others outsourced, and the expectations generationally of work life has fundamentally shifted. And while it has always been true, the past 1.5 years of global pandemic have asked us to consider what is essential, where we work, how we work, and why. Water is essential to our economy, to our environment, and so too is the workforce that keeps it running. So in the 50 minutes that we have here together, we're going to invite you to consider the GCD workforce and how it will navigate the changing and growing population in Texas. Before I turn to our brilliant panelists, I'd like to paint a national picture for you in terms of workforce changes in water. And so I'm going to start here. From a national landscape perspective, what we know is that almost a third of water professionals will be at or nearing retirement in the next few years. While that feels like an alarming fact, know that there are a number of entities that are researching this, including the EPA, with a number of programs in water workforce development, as well as Brookings Institute. And also know that that is not unique to the water sector. A number of workforce sectors are experiencing the same type of generational shift, sometimes referred to as the silver tsunami. But it is important in terms of water because it is an essential workforce and because we need to make sure that we are investing in the pipeline of opportunity of young water professionals. The other thing that we know on a global scale is that by 2025, 75% of the workforce will be millennials. And with that comes some generational shift in expectations. And studies have shown that some of those factors include things like work-life balance, purpose over paycheck, diversity and inclusion, expectations of employers to consider that, time off, and benefits like maternity, paternity, and adoption leave. And you ask, why is that important? It's important because as you consider how to recruit and retain workforce, that you take those things into consideration. There is also a changing tide in Texas, so let's take a look at the GCD workforce really quickly to set a stage for our discussion. Of all of the challenges and threats to groundwater, you're probably not thinking about workforce development as one of those. And one of the things, okay, so let's paint a landscape here, and I have to always give the caveat, right, with TAG surveys, is that these statistics are coming from those who responded. So I believe in this case, Leah and Julia provided me with a statistic that 69 of the 90 TAG members responded to this survey, so please take that into consideration when you see these numbers. So here's the landscape. We've got a median budget of $375,000, median staff of 2, a breakdown of 47 males to 22 females, and most importantly, an age distribution in our general managers that is similar to the national statistic, thinking about that 1/3 of the sector retiring. 31 of the 69 respondents are over the age of 60. 17 of the respondents are between the ages of 50 and 59, 14 between 40 and 49, and 7 between 30 and 39. Although we do have a caveat, one of them is just below 30 and sitting on this panel today. In terms of the workforce, and thinking about some of the benefits and kind of general statistics there, 47 of the 69 respondents offer health insurance coverage, but only 3 pay the employee premium. 49 provide at least 10 days of paid time off. 14 provide paid parental leave. One district offers 12 weeks, which, as you might know, is consistent with the FMLA standards. 21 pay for additional education or training, meaning they invest in their staff. And 9 allow for permanent or long-term remote work. That means 60 do not. So, what we know is in terms of the respondents, the 69 respondents to this survey, where we asked if you had plans to retire in the next few years, we can estimate that about 20% of our GMs are going to plan to retire in the next 5 years. Okay, so consistent with what we're seeing on a national stage, and pretty alarming if you think about the number of GCDs and what that means in terms of generational turnover. So when we're talking about hiring, retention, and succession planning, here's a couple other statistics to throw out at you. Of the 69 respondents, 54 employ a full-time GM. That's important because some of them are employing part-time GMs or contract kind of variations of it. 8 employ an assistant GM. Of the 69 respondents, 16 have one employee, and every single one of those is in a rural district. 26 of the 69 respondents are actively engaged right now in succession planning. Succession planning meaning, what are you going to do when your GM retires or there is a staff change? Here's another really interesting thing. 20 GMs that are currently, of the 69 respondents, 20 of them were hired to replace retiring GMs, meaning that was a succession plan. That was an intentional decision. And 25 of the GMs worked at the GCD prior to becoming GM. Okay, so now we go to our panel discussion, where we're really going to be talking about managing expected and unexpected. And here are the topics we're going to be covering, and I'm going to turn it over and walk over here real quick. All right, can y'all still hear me? Yes, excellent, that carried over. All right, so on this panel today, we have 3 brilliant GMs that come to us at different times in their career and in terms of their tenure. I'm going to introduce them each as we get to them, but first I'd like to turn to Meredith Irward-Allen, who is the general manager of the Sutton County Groundwater Conservation District and contract GM to which ones?
Menard and Kimball. Yeah.
That's right, great. So when I think about the next generation of GMs, you really come to mind to me, and specifically because you were very intentional in how it is that you built your career into water, going to A&M specifically to study water, I think with Zach, right?
Yeah.
And working for Representative Price, interning at Post Oak Savannah, so you groomed yourself to be a water professional because you wanted to route back to living at home in Sutton County, correct? And so now you're in the process of raising your next generation. Tell us about that journey for you.
Yeah, so it all started, I was the Aggie intern for Price, and he allowed me to track the water legislation for that session. And so while doing that is where I met a lot of groundwater district managers. C.E. Williams was one of the first people I met, obviously being in Forest District, and Zach Holland, Gary Westbrook, all of those guys. And while I was interning, I really got to learn about groundwater districts and how they worked. And you know, Zach really pushed me to do the water program like he had done. And so when I went back to A&M, I was in the A&M water program, and I interned for Gary at Post Oak Savannah, which was an amazing experience. I learned so much, you know, just how the daily, you know, work goes for a groundwater district. You don't learn that in school. And so having that hands-on experience was really eye-opening for me and really showed me that that's what I wanted to do. And I knew I have a lot of ties to Sonora, to that part of Texas, and I knew I wanted to go back there. And it was clear to me that was something I could do back in my hometown. And so after I graduated from the water program, I was under Jim Polonis, who was the current manager, and he was looking to retire. And so I trained under him for a few years, and then took his role when he retired. So.
But you also had to kind of craft your own position out there, right? So
yes.
We're both. So there's a couple of elements, right? So one, you were from a rural district, wanting to get back there. You pursued, you know, you invested in your career, and other GCDs invested in you as well. You were part of a succession plan, but you also had to do a little bit of curation and mix and match. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So at the time, there was only 3 positions. There was the general manager, the technician, and then a part-time administrative assistant. And so Jim really advocated for me and convinced our board that it was the right decision to create another position as an assistant GM, really, and give me the opportunity to train under him. And they went for it, which I was very grateful for. You know, these water districts are tax-based and they don't have the biggest budgets, and so they really had to be, you know, figure out how to make that work, and they made it work for me, and I was very grateful for that. And right about that time, as I was coming back, then several water district managers in that area who were also looking to retire started, you know, seeing that and seeing the value of having someone who has experience in groundwater districts, has a background in water management, take those roles. And so we were able to work out where I am, you know, helping the other 2 districts and Sutton County. And it's worked out really, really well for me too, so.
Great. So last thing I want to ask you about before I jump over to Vanessa is that you also have had 2 kids in the process of being GM. And congratulations on that.
Yes.
And so I wondered if you could share a little bit about what that process was like in terms of, you know, parental policies.
Yeah, so when I started at Sutton County, they didn't have a maternity leave policy, mainly because they never had to have a maternity leave policy. They've never were in that situation where they had a young female, you know, in those positions. So it was a very easy process. I brought it up to the board. We went through and created a policy, and you know, it was new and it was something we had to figure out, but we did it and it was great. You know, there is, so I did have a maternity leave policy, but it is always hard when you are the manager and there are people applying for permitted wells, and you know, there's deadlines for that. So that was a little tricky to figure out how to manage those issues, but we were able to do it. And then when I had my son, I was working for the 3 water districts, and so it was the same thing, and they just jumped on board, and we figured out a maternity leave for me, and it went pretty smoothly. But when I started at all 3 districts, none of them had a maternity leave policy in place when I started. That was something that I had to bring to them and figure out what would work best for each district. So.
Well, as with all mothers, total super mom coming in 9 days after and filling out a well application.
Yeah. Thankfully, a lot of it was we were able to do a lot virtually. You know, we do a lot of our applications now online, which was something I really pushed so that I was able to help out while I was on leave and not have to go into the office all the time. I was able to approve some of those things from home. So.
Awesome.
But yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to jump over and speak with Vanessa Escobar, who is the general manager at the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Groundwater District, and at an interesting crossroads in your career right now, so that you joined this panel in a time of transition, and shared with us in our preparation call as we were getting to know each other in this story that you have watched the district over the years experience change in different formats, both expected and unexpected. And something that really came through in our conversation was how many different elements can affect the stability and growth of a district. And so I wondered if you could share some of your observations looking at a planned retirement, an unplanned staff change, and kind of how that affects a district.
Sure, well, thank you for having me here. So when I came on board at the district about 10 years ago, I had the fortune of moving over from the conservation world into groundwater. And I came over about a decade ago when things were like a little calmer, at least at the district and groundwater world in general. And at least that's how I perceived it to be. And so I started off as a regulatory permitting specialist. And I came into a district that, you know, that had a really good reputation, a solid science and policy framework. We were already 25 years into our, you know, post-creation. And so we were really at our prime, kind of just perfecting our science and our regulatory framework. And so things started to get interesting right around that time. A couple years after I joined, the EAA cases came out, Day case and Bragg case. Some of those legacy cases came down, the rulings. And so some things started to change, right? And then from there, we actually went through an annexation experience in our district where some folks, you know, selected our district to take over managing the Trinity and a large portion of Hays County. And so that was quite a unique circumstance to find ourselves in, because we were both a very seasoned, experienced district that also was experiencing the challenges that some startup districts experience. And so there was a real sense of urgency to establish some data sets, to build scientific models, and establish some policies and regulatory frameworks for this new area. And so that was quite a big change for our district and our history. And then to overlap on top of that, like most organizations at some point or another, you go through natural transitions. People leave, you bring on new people. And so it's just a part of growth of an organization. And so there's opportunities that present itself. But that was definitely, the time frame where things started to kind of compile onto each other. And so when you add various layers of transition, that's where an organization starts to face, things that might feel a little bit unstable. And so, I feel like during that time frame, as people were leaving and new people were coming in, we had the benefit of experiencing both ends of the spectrum when it comes to succession planning. We've had the benefit of having time, which, when one GM can see that they're going to be phasing out and retiring, they can select their successor and train them up and really get them primed up to lead. And in that case, it's a very seamless transition, and it's easier on staff and board and constituents. And then sometimes things are unplanned, all of a sudden a change, happens at the leadership level. And when there's not a plan in place, it's much more of a reactive response. And so that can lead to different layers of stress, for depending on who you are, your role in the organization. So I would say, oftentimes we get caught up in some of these transitions, and we're just in the midst of it, trying to survive, trying to react. And I think we don't really take the time to kind of take a step back and reflect, like, what are the factors that ultimately lead to stability in a district or instability. And I would say, that when we think about factors that lead to stability, I think most of our GCDs feel they're the most effective, successful, and stable when we have good funding mechanisms, when we have stable leadership on the board and in the management roles, when we have, no real regulatory challenges that we're faced with immediately, and in general, just financial stability. And so for districts that find themselves in those positions, usually we feel good about our science, where we're at with our science-based policies and having good engaged boards. And typically we also have, really capable staff that have institutional knowledge and really informed board directors. So those are factors that I say lead to stability. And then factors that really lead to instability, I would say, are often external factors, like things like legal challenges or legislative shifts or local politics, pandemics, things that, really do cause.
Things you can absolutely control,
yes.
Right?
And so I would say, from our experience being a rapidly urbanizing district, that those districts are probably a little more vulnerable because some of these issues are much more prevalent. And so I would just recommend that, districts in that transitioning zone, just give some thought to just preparing and planning to the extent you can.
Thank you. And I know we're going to talk about some of those techniques. Thank you for sharing that story, and especially in such a rapidly growing tech metropolis like Austin, you'll definitely have got some challenges. Steve Walthour, GM of the North Plains Groundwater Conservation District. You have been at the helm of one of the biggest and oldest groundwater districts for, what did we decide, 4.25 years?
14,
that's what I said.
Yes.
That's what I meant. Yes,
Yeah.
That's right. I said 15 and he corrected me.
Yeah.
And you have seen change occur within within the EAA structure, but also you were recruited, if I remember correctly, to North Plains because there was a change that was necessary. So we've talked about changes and instability and stability, And one of the things that really resonated with me in our conversation is how you propose that change is not always a bad thing, and the ways in which it can be an opportunity for growth and transformation at a district level. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you've observed in your years of leadership at a groundwater district level.
Well, back in 1992, I was getting married to my bride today. A few months later, and a few months after Meredith was born, I saw this little note in the Austin American-Statesman. We were living there in Lakeway at the time, and it was for Geologist 3 at the Edwards Underground Water District, and my background is carbonate petrology. I thought that would be really cool to go down there and look at the limestone. So I applied and went in, and as I was headed down there, I understood what it was going to cost for me to do that. It was a substantial decrease in salary. And as I was talking to the person who was going to be my supervisor, a guy named Bob Botter, he was telling me about all these neat things that he needed to get done and didn't know how to do. And by the time I'd walked in thinking, well, maybe I'm going to tell them I can't really do this. And after that, I met my wife at Finkel's after that. We were headed out on our honeymoon. And I says, I have a problem. And she said, well, what is it? Says, I really want to take the job, but I don't know if we can afford it. And she said, oh, okay. She was in love with me a lot then. She said, oh, okay, honey, yeah, we will do that if that's really what you want to do. So I took the job, and a few months later, she says, now, how much are they paying you? And that started my career as a groundwater with the groundwater conservation districts. We had the opportunity there to do some fun things. And I reflected back after starting this, what has moved me along into all the things I've done and have seen is it has to be fun. I enjoy the fun parts. And we could rattle off a list of things I did for the Edwards Underground Water District with an unbelievable staff. They were going through change because apparently their entire geo staff, except my boss, had left, and they'd replaced the geo 3, me, the 2, and a 1, and ended up with a great staff. And we did a lot of stuff for a few years. And then in 93, after I started in 92, I find out that we're going to be abolished. And I'd already been laid off a couple of times, so I stuck around and to see how it was going to work out. And I was out doing, working on a real-time data collection network in 96 when we got a call that the Edwards finally started. A few months later, the general manager at the time asked me to do something called initial regular permitting. And I think he asked me because I had a fairly good organizational skill. I had learned on-the-job training. If I graduated in early 80s, so almost all the computer training I had was OTJ, on the job. And I started doing the permitting for the authority. That took me away from doing the science, and I always thought that once I finished, or once the authority could afford to hire someone who knew what they were doing, I would go back to doing the science. In the end, Greg decided, when he came on, he decided to leave me at that position, and I had a wonderful career working for the Edwards, working on permitting, metering, and that thing, and that led me to my job today.
And what Sarah asked you was, Steve, what could possibly tempt you to want to commute between Dumas, Texas, and to your lovely bride every week for 14.25 years?
My job is fun. It's fun. I've taken, that was not the only pay cut I've taken. I took a cut at the Edwards Aquifer Authority to stay in a position that I really liked and not take something else because of what I was doing at the time I thought would be fun. I went and interviewed with the North Plains District. They were in the middle of change. They decided to meter all their wells in their district, and they'd set up a program. I'd actually talked to them a few years before. I didn't know it was them, and they had implemented some changes that I could fit in there, and I started. As I left the interview, Keith Good down here, their attorney, was in the interview. I won't talk about that was behind closed doors, but I got in the car and started headed back, and going to the airport. I'd had a hernia surgery, and my pain medication was wearing off. And Lauren called me and says, "What do you think?" And well, if they want to do what they said they want to do, and this is important, the board hired me because they really wanted to go in the direction they were talking about. And so I got the job opportunity, and it's been fun. There's always a few down things, but I've been blessed. I've had one of the best boards I think anyone could have. We've had some board turnover. When you tell a bunch of farmers they all have to put meters on their wells, you lose a.
I hear it's a popular approach in the
Oh,
Panhandle.
absolutely. It's a wonderful thing. But we did it, and that board really stepped up and did that. So I ended up at the North Plains. One of the things that I worked in on this succession planning is simply, I'm trying to train my staff and get my staff trained to the extent of whether it's one of them or somebody coming in to the business, they're going to have a very well-trained group of people. I checked my numbers. My average staff tenure there is about 8 years. My average is 8 years out of 15 people.
I would say on a national level, that's probably impressive. And actually, I'm glad you brought up skills, because that leads us directly into this next phase.
Yeah.
And I have to acknowledge as well, when I joined TAG, I think that you're the one who groomed me in reading financials, so thank you for that.
That was precisely the thing that my board had a problem with me, because I really had not had the financial part. And I think one of the board members, Danny Krinke, says that was really our biggest concern. I was scared to death of financials, so I learned them. And I think that happens to a lot. Most of the stuff you do as a general manager is really on-the-job training.
So let's talk about staff retention, about the skills that are changing, and I want to turn it over to a little bit of friendly banter between us. And I'm watching the time, y'all, so that's why I'm leading us over here. It's hard to recruit good talent. Some of that, you have to groom yourself or commute into Dumas, Texas. And it's really hard to keep it. So 8 years is a good statistic. So I'm curious about the conversations you're having on ways to incentivize and to retain good talent. And in terms of the GCD workforce needs, what skills are you seeing as important that are changing? Thinking about Steve's note, he was hired for a very particular skill set at a very particular time, and that might be different in the future in terms of what the GCD needs. So
It sure will be.
Meredith, I'm curious about what conversations are you having about how to incentivize and retain talent?
Yeah, so when I started at Sutton County, there was 3 staff members there, and they were all over 60 and looking to retire, and 2 of them retired pretty quickly after I became the manager. So and the manager in Menard and Kimball were retiring as well. And so I looked up and realized it was just me, and it was time to hire new staff. And it was an interesting process. And what I was really looking for, and we've gotten it there now, is someone who can problem solve. That's something that's so important. When you work for a groundwater district, especially in rural Texas, you're not going to hire someone who has previous experience with a water district or in like a technician. You're going to have to train them to do those things. And so I'm looking for problem solvers who can get on board and fill in when they need to be filling in and make it happen. And that was something that I changed as well. Previous to me, everyone had their role and they did their job, and now I try to encourage us all to know all of our jobs so that we can fill in when we need to, and that's been, it took us a little while, but we got there, and that's the most important, is to have a good team that's excited about doing what we're doing, and that's been something that's been really important.
And you shared with us on the call that you actually took the radical leadership role of hiring somebody that didn't have the technical skill set as opposed to other candidates because of their problem-solving attitude.
Yes, we had had several techs that had come and gone, and they all had oilfield background. Being in Sutton County, that's something that's common, and so they had a lot of field experience, And I realized, this isn't working. That's not really what we need. We need someone who has database experience, who is organized, who can help us get our wells. My very first job at Post Oak Savannah as an intern, as an undergrad, was scanning in one by one all of the well registrations, so I knew how important that was, and I had done it myself, and I knew that getting an electronic database is so important, and so I had to kind of convince my board to shift their focus on what the tech role looked like and where we could improve, and I can train somebody to measure a well. That is something that's trainable, but to have the organizational skills and the problem-solving skills when you're working on databases, that's something that is not as easy to train. So
you're saying Gary Westbrook directly turned you into the GM that you are today?
I told him I didn't want him to be in here. I didn't want him to get a big head. But no, yes, I tell people all the time. I had legislative experience. I got my master's in water management, and the one thing that has been the most beneficial to me was my internship at Post Oak Savannah, because it's so real world. You see people applying for permitted wells. You see how a board is reacting to that. You see how a manager is dealing with, board members that are maybe on different pages, and you're having to navigate those different personalities, and you're
Gary has experience with that?
Yeah, just a little. And working with staff, I was young, and I was hiring people who are older than me, and I'm their boss, and that's, and knowing how to manage that is, I had to learn a lot, and it was, and Bobby too. I can't leave Bobby out too. He was a great mentor to me, but just seeing the real world aspect of it and the daily aspect of it was so beneficial to me, and really helped me. I had done some tech work with Bobby, and so I knew what I was looking for, I guess, when I was building my own team.
So I want to ask Vanessa also, because I think that you mentioned that you're doing some cross-training, right, between different staff, or that you had been thinking about it in that way in terms of just institutional stability. And so as I prep you for that, I know that one of the things you said about hiring from the oil field is, and it makes me think about the challenges in retaining staff within groundwater districts, and you brought up your budget, is that it turns out the oil field pays a little better than groundwater districts?
Yeah, that's been a problem for us in all three districts is, we do have small budgets, and so, trying to make that work and incentivize people to come work for the groundwater district in other ways, maybe, benefits and things like that.
So it was good to invest in somebody who stuck around. So Vanessa, your thoughts on
especially
challenges?
Someone having 2 babies and is only been a GM for 6 months, and
So your thoughts on challenges in retaining staff, and kind of your thoughts on what conversations have you been having within your staff and within your board about incentivizing and retaining talent?
Yes. So, we've been having this conversation for a few years now, as you heard when some of our major transitions began. I think, we've really had to reflect as to, what it takes to keep people happy, to keep people at an organization, to feel like they're doing meaningful, rewarding work. I think our district has been very fortunate. We've had a lot of people stay, half our staff has been there 20 plus years, so that says a lot to the organization and our philosophies on providing benefits and compensation for employees. And I think everyone that has stayed there really has a strong connection to the mission. And so, like what Steve was saying, it's rewarding. We're not there to become rich, but we're there to address the issues of resource management in our own backyards. And so eventually, good people are going to leave and retire. And so we've been thinking about, what it takes to cross-train. Because in our district, no one district's alike, but in our district, we have a complex hydrogeologic setting with our aquifer systems. In a sense, that kind of leads to a complex regulatory framework, which then leads to possibly intensive oversight and day-to-day operations. And with changes like annexation, that can lead to burnout. Are we growing in ways that are, that we're taking on too much, or that our staff is becoming stretched thin? And so we have to reflect on what's needed to keep them and to give them resources to be effective.
I'm so glad that you said that word because I find myself saying a lot recently that I think our biggest occupational hazard as water professionals is burnout. And I'm being totally serious. I mean, between the emotional, psychological stress.
Really?
Really?
No.
Not you, Steve. You're an exemption. But I know that personally, you and I have spoken about time off and the importance of that. We certainly have talked about it within the Texas Water Leaders course. And can you share a little bit about your kind of personal thoughts, philosophies, or from a GM perspective on how to avoid burnout or policies that you've had in place?
Sure. I mean, I think anyone can appreciate who's a GM or even just works at a groundwater district that there's more work to be done than time, right? And so sometimes you find yourself in that rhythm of like, I'm going to work a little more hours on the weekend just to stay caught up. And, you know, it can turn into a bad habit. So you really have to be effective, to be a good leader for your staff and for your organization, you do need to take time off and refresh yourself and make sure you have that balance in life. Because at the end of the day, you know, what matters most are your family, your health. And so, you know, in the groundwater district world, you know, things I think are becoming a little more challenging. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I think we can personalize that, internalize that, you know, if we're not careful. But I do think that it's important to take time off, and I know our organization fosters that kind of work culture. You know, we encourage people to take vacations. We give people more weeks of vacation the longer they stay. So it's a very natural part of our organization, and we don't make people feel guilty about it. And we're really flexible and treat employees uniquely based on their circumstances. Like, you know, when people go on maternity leave or paternity leave, when people have health issues or, you know, need to take mental health days, those things matter because we want to keep these people because they do a hard job. And although we're all like political subdivisions, it's not really like any other government sector job, you know, where you have one niche and you're doing one thing. I mean, we're doing everything from HR to legal stuff to facility management and dealing, you know, with unpleasant people sometimes. And so it's a lot to ask of people. And so you have to think about that.
And it makes me think if you kind of correlate that then with some of the demographic shifts that we're talking about in terms of age, in terms of gender, think about how all of that also coincides then with expectations. If you have small children at home, can you work 20-hour days and take care of both of your kids?
No.
I want to turn it over. We've got just a few minutes before we turn it over to questions. I want to ask you, Steve, about the conversations that you've been having with yourself, with your board, with your staff about succession planning, how you're thinking about that, how you're thinking about the changes and skills that are needed. How are you approaching that conversation?
Well, first thing is that we've got our meter program involved. We have production reporting for roughly 20% of all the groundwater pumped in the state. They turn in their reports. So the compliance issue that they hired me for is well in hand with our attorneys. Keith and Ellen has worked well with us. So what we do is look at things where are our really spots that we need extra. We've got a couple of bookkeepers now. We have one person who's the bookkeeper and somebody else who can write payroll. We have, my entire staff is engaged. They participate in SOPs, standard operating procedures, and that nature. And I'm trying to prepare the entire staff for whoever the board wants to hire. I do have an assistant general manager, Kirk Welch. His skill set is a speech. His degrees in speech, I think with radio and TV kind of connection.
Did y'all know that about Kirk? He comes from the radio and TV world. I mean, talk about a different skill set for a GM.
But we're looking at conservation outreach now. You know, how do we put stuff out? And he's got some really good staff. He worked with Julia before she came to work here, and I'm sure by the time this conversation's over today, Julia will have 9 more ideas to share with Leah later because she's full of ideas, and I like that. I like people who are engaged, who are excited about showing up to work, and we work it that way. So whenever the board decides what they want to do to hire, they'll have a choice. I was unique. I was outside of the panhandle. That had never really happened before, and the skill set I had was on-the-job training. So I think the skill sets we'll be looking at in the future are going to be more public speaking, that type of thing, more conservation. We have a lot of conservation programs. And that's how we've, It'll be up to Kirk to sell himself to the board if he wants that job. And we're giving him the opportunity to do things like manage the only conservation demonstration field in the state. He handles the Twitterverse. He has people who handle the Twitterverse, whatever that is. I don't know what that is. And he's got a real opportunity. I also got a couple of staff members. One's wanting to be a PG, professional geoscientist, which, by the way, I'm going to have one geoscientist in the next 2 or 3 years retire. Our turnover is going to be about a third in the next 5 years, I suspect. And that's what we're doing for development. We send people to school. Kirk went to your program. Yep. Next year, I'll be sending Kristen to your program.
And something that is very evident in what you shared with us is that you and your board have chosen to invest in your staff, and that you invest in them in order to lead, whether that is with you or elsewhere. I think Dave Mock, my former employer, said once that he invests in his staff so he can proliferate his control across the state. So as they go, he can extend his influence. You do that, but you also have taken, I think, a really refreshing approach in thinking about the skills that might be needed of a GM in the future might be different than what they were when you were hired, and thinking about succession planning, not as a direct replacement of yourself, but what does the district need in that moment? And that's really wonderful. I want to give some moments for questions. So to inspire the questions, I'm going to ask each of you in 20 seconds or less to share if you had one piece of recommendation for GMs, staff, and board members here to think about why to invest in the next generation of water leaders, or something to do to kind of help in that stability, what would it be? And I'll just go down the line.
Sure. I mean, I was going to echo what you just said, to invest in your staff, in your people, invest in professional development, invest in your compensation and benefits for them, invest in having well cross-trained staff, and most importantly, invest, for board members to invest their confidence and trust in the staff and the GMs, because they're the ones who are running these organizations and wearing all the hats.
Yes, I often observed that while the GM's job is to have the back of all of their staff, the board's job is also to have the GM's back. And so that's something that comes out a lot. Meredith?
Yeah, well, and going off of investing, when we think of succession planning, a lot of times we think about hiring within and going up. But in my experience, I felt like Post Oak Savannah really did invest in me, and I was just an intern. And so internship programs, I think, is something that Groundwater District should really be looking at, especially if you're close to a university or, more urban settings. And Gary knew from the start that I wasn't planning to stay in that area. He knew my heart was in Sutton County, and he still really invested in me and really trained me, knowing that I was going to leave Post Oak Savannah and go a different way. And so that's something else to think about. I think it's a great, it was great for me, and I could see it benefiting, especially the rural districts, if you come out to those rural areas with experience with groundwater districts. And so
it benefits all of the GCDs, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
Gary's investment benefited Jim, and it benefits all of us as well.
Yeah, it's the same as
Thank you, Gary.
He's expanding his empire out into West Texas.
There you go, expanding the empire. That's the strategy.
Yeah.
Steve, final word?
My previous board president, said, and I agree with this, is that the most important thing for a board member to do is to be educated and engaged. And if you don't do those two things as a board member, you don't know what your responsibilities are and what you need to be doing. And that applies to the staff, investing in your staff to make sure your staff's educated and engaged, keeping them interested and fun. So I would say that's the biggest takeaway I would leave, is that for board and general managers, education and engagement.
Thank you. Well, hopefully this has inspired you to think a little bit about planned and unplanned changes at the district. Think about succession planning, think about investing in your staff, and think also about some of those generational changes and expectations, particularly as we live through a global pandemic. Work-life harmony, I know we scoff at it sometimes, but it really is key to retaining talented staff. Are there any questions from the audience? Any challenges that you'd like to bring up? Okay. Well, with that, join me in thanking our brilliant panelists. Or do you have a question?
I did get a couple in here.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I think I saw a statistic that said that within that millennial study, the 75% of leaders are going to be millennials. They said that if you invest in your staff, you're more likely to retain in them because they feel like they want to stay, right? So strategy. Go ahead.
This question came in and then Steve made a point, but I think it's worth maybe having a little more dialogue on it regarding board involvement and how to kind of convince your board to strike that balance between supporting a GM without micromanaging, but giving them what they need and what your experiences are with that. Any advice you may have?
With my district, my district's large enough that I get to make most of the day-to-day decisions. That a smaller district, less funds, the board would be more involved. I have 15 employees. I've got several consultants, but the other 7 people that are part of my team is my board, and my board is engaged in all of our conservation programs, and that's good. And they do policy, but I handle the day-to-day as far as the operations of the district.
Any thoughts from either of you on striking that balance?
I think it's just important for the board to form a good, solid working dynamic with the staff and the GM. Obviously, that's the GM's main role. But I think, for the board to have a sense of what the staff does and just kind of ask the right questions and try to get informed and educated is really important. And then for the staff to understand that the board's there to represent the constituency and to have some kind of trust in each other that works both ways is kind of leads to more effectiveness and success collectively.
Something that occurs to me that I think about often is that water is more than pipes and technology. It's informed decision makers, and so I'm so glad that you brought up the trust part, because the trust and legitimacy I feel like is not considered as much in terms of building the trust between GM and the board, and making sure the systems and the human governance piece of it is just as important as the technology and the policy decision.
Yeah, and actually a second question also came in on the board topic. You talked about recruitment of general managers and staff. What about recruiting new board members, particularly, how do you get people ready and willing to run for a position on a GCD board?
Have you all had any strategies in terms of offering educational opportunities, or how has that looked?
We're going through some board transition right now and trying to recruit the next successors. I think we've talked about going into the community groups, the ones that are engaged in trying to support the district's mission and managing the aquifers sustainably, and just trying to recruit active kind of leaders from those organizations to come and participate and follow conversations at our district and at our board level. It's an extra commitment for people, so I think we're in some areas of our district it's a little challenging to get some interest. But I do think you have to treat board succession just like the GM has to treat internal succession. Be thoughtful about it and actually plan for it in advance. Otherwise, you find yourself in a reactive mode with either no interested candidates, or maybe the wrong kind of candidates.
Sure. I mean, there have been several examples of where very vocal minorities can overtake a board.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, in the rural setting, it is always difficult to find board members, and when we get into that situation. But problem solving, just like my staff, I try to recruit board members who can problem solve, who are willing to take on the task, because it is a task, and they are serving to do it. And I encourage them to come to these programs like this, the conference, and some tag trainings. I've had some board members come to some tag trainings in the past, and that's been really beneficial too.
In the 14 years I've been there, we've had 2 board members who lost an election, and we got 2 new ones. I've had a couple more that have changed, but we spend a lot of time after the election or before it, if someone who's running, to talk about what the job is and go over that. But we spend a lot of time once we know, who the parties are, to try to train them to do that. I don't have to look for board members, except when someone resigns and I have to fill something for a short period of time. I've been really blessed there, so hope we'll continue to do that same system.
Well, that was a fantastic panel, a lot of food for thought, and they're really important conversations, not necessarily easy ones. Just yesterday, in our announcements in the TAG meeting, there are 4 retirements that we announced, so it's very timely for sure. Thank you, panel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.